Today's first panel, entitled Understanding Genocide, is going to look at genocide beyond the legal definition. So much of the discourse when it comes to the Gaza genocide has been focused on understanding how exactly the conduct of Israel in this moment is satisfying the legal definition. But today, in this morning's panel, we'd like to explore the question of genocide from other angles, notably the question of genocide first and foremost as a state crime and how it has evolved historically, the history of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and also the ethical implications and consequences of genocide. So with that said, I'd like to invite to the stage Dr. Penny Green, who needs no introduction because she's been with us for the last several days in various capacities, to discuss genocide as a state crime, understanding it as a process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lara. As Lara said, well, this submission argues, A, that genocide is best understood not through legal definitions, but through a state crime paradigm, which centres on human rights violations committed in pursuit of state organisational goals. That's the definition that my colleague Tony Ward and I developed to counter legal definitions which are wholly inadequate when it comes to defining crimes committed by states. I'm also going to talk about the idea that genocide is not an event, but a process with well-defined, often congruent phases, and that it's rooted in the structures of dehumanization that in the case of Palestine are animated by settler colonialism. It briefly also compares Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people with Myanmar's genocide of the Rohingya, because Tom McManus and I have done considerable work on the Rohingya genocide. Israel's genocide against the Palestinians, with its origins in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, has been in progress for over 100 years. The post-October 7th catastrophe inflicted by Gaza, by Israel, and increasingly on the West Bank, represents what we would understand as the annihilatory phase of a genocidal process that has not yet ended, but began with the dehumanization of Palestinians back in 1917, when Balfour essentially gifted the land of Palestine to European Zionists. This genocidal process must be understood not in terms of a singular history of events initiated by Israel after October the 7th, but a process driven by extreme ethno-supremacist ambitions. All state crimes, including genocide, involve human rights violations perpetrated by state agents to advance that state's specific organisational goals. State crimes are thus violations of social norms which may or may not reflect formal legal norms. They are less usefully understood as legal constructs defined and punished by domestic and international laws and courts. With lawmakers infamously unwilling to define state practices as criminal, it's critical that we have an alternative, robust definition of crimes committed by ruling regimes. Just as with the vast majority of conventional crime, real solutions to state crime lie well outside the frameworks of criminal justice, law, international conventions, and international courts. With a state crime framework, any such solutions to crimes such as genocide are much more likely to be found in the struggles of a state's victims and with those who advocate and organise as allies of those victims and survivors. And it's only the political organisation of those victims and their allies that not only has the power to challenge state violence and corruption, but is central in defining and labelling that violence as criminal in the first instance. Civil society is crucial to this approach, and while complex and not uniformly progressive, it nonetheless enjoys widespread legitimacy as an authoritative check on the power and actions of the state. It affords the most effective means of identifying and confronting state violence and corruption. Because civil society operates from the ground up, It has far greater agility and capacity to recognise the processes involved in earlier stages of state crimes than the mechanisms of a highly politicised, bureaucratised and slow international legal order. In cases of state crime, civil society has proven itself extremely effective in gathering, verifying and analysing evidence. It has been much more effective than international law at naming and resisting the crimes of states, particularly through campaigns of civil disobedience, mass strikes, boycotts, divestment and sanctions, and tribunals of conscience, such as the Gaza Tribunal at which we're present today. Civil society has been at the heart of all evidence gathering and verification in relation to both Israel's and Myanmar's crimes. And we've heard a lot about the evidence gathered by organisations such as Al-Haq here today about Israel's crimes. And this work by civil society has led efforts to successfully name those crimes as apartheid and ultimately genocide. Drawing on the work of Daniel Fierstein, it's especially useful to understand genocide in terms of discrete yet overlapping phases. Genocide begins with dehumanisation. He talks about stigmatisation. I think dehumanisation is more fitting. And it ends with physical and symbolic erasure. In between, and often concurrent, are a number of recognisable stages. Occasions, and I'm sure that these are stages that you will recognise, occasions of litmus testing violence, which, when tolerated, signal impunity. Forced isolation and segregation of the target population in the form of structural apartheid. Systematic weakening of that targeted population, much easier to weaken a population when they are segregated in prison villages, ghettos, and open-air prisons. Then we have mass annihilation. And of course, once you have people corralled into very small spaces, it's much easier, and to think of them as systematically weakened, much easier to annihilate them in various forms. And we know that you don't have to commit mass murder in order to annihilate a population. It can be done by mass forced expulsions and so on. Following annihilation and often starting much earlier in the process, but it is almost like the end game, we have the phase of what Fierstein calls symbolic enactment, during which we witness denial, reconstruction, and historical revisionism on the part of the perpetrators. But I think genocide doesn't even end there. I think that the humanitarian camp is something that we should be focusing on, and I would argue that it plays a pivotal role in prolonging and even reproducing genocide. In all the post-genocidal camps that I've been in and where I've witnessed the experiences of those in those camps, in Myanmar, Bangladesh and Palestine, we see the same processes of dehumanisation, forced segregation, isolation, violence and systematic attempts at weakening the whole camp population. I've been struck by the parallels between the Rohingya and the Palestinian experiences of annihilation, expulsion, spatial segregation and destruction, mass weakening and violent erasure. The Myanmar state's genocide was not driven by the logic of settler colonialism, but it shares with Israel the ultimate goal of an ethno-religious supremacist state. The echoes of 1948 Palestine could not have been more resonant in 2017 Rakhine State in Myanmar, when the Burmese military, in league with State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, killed some 15,000 to 20,000 Rohingya and forced 800,000 to flee across the border into Bangladesh, and destroyed over 350 Rohingya villages in the process. I'm not going to talk about the Palestinian statistics because they've been told already at this tribunal, but you can see that the comparisons are very apposite. Today, over 5.5 million Palestinians live in 68 refugee camps across Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria and Lebanon, driven there after the Nakba and Israel's 67 war. With Israel's annihilation of Gaza now eclipsing the 1948 Nakba in magnitude, the future of 2.3 million Gazans, 80% of whom are already either Nakba refugees or their descendants, will be defined by the humanitarian camp. And this terrible reality, combined with continued existence of Palestinian camps decades after Israel's first genocidal violence, offers a bleak portent for the future of the Rohingya, 1.2 million of whom languish in Bangladesh's Balukhali Kutupalong camp complex. Israel and Burma, Myanmar, have been close allies since the 1950s. Not only have they enacted similar practices of historical and cultural erasure against populations they want to see gone, but they've also assisted each other in figuratively reimagining their societies, absented the targeted populations. In May of 2018, just months after Myanmar's genocidal clearances of the Rohingya, Israel signed an education cooperation agreement with Myanmar's regime. The agreement provides that each state, and I quote, through their competent authorities endeavour to mutually verify school textbooks, particularly concerning the passages referring to the history of the other state, and, where needed, introduce corrections to these textbooks. Israel's Deputy Foreign Minister, Tzipi Hotovely, described the agreement with Myanmar as cooperation with our friends. Myanmar and Israel ensure that the fictionalised history of the genocidaire is the officially reported history, and that future generations are socialised in that history and learn nothing of those who were the victim of genocide. During the worst of the state-perpetrated violence directed at the Rohingya, Israel also transferred weapons to Myanmar, fully cognizant that the weapons would be used against Myanmar's many minorities, including the Rohingya. Despite a gag order about Israel's arms deals with the Myanmar junta, evidence of those deals defying US and European arms embargoes was proudly displayed by the junta on their Facebook page. When Myanmar was taken before the ICJ for alleged breaches of the Genocide Convention, the same breaches that Israel was taken to the ICJ for, Ronen Gilor, Israel's ambassador to Myanmar, tweeted, "Encouragement for a good verdict and good luck." In January 2024, the International Court of Justice issued its interim ruling, recognising that there was a plausible risk of genocide by the State of Israel, and ordered Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent genocidal acts, already required if you're a signatory to the Genocide Convention, of course. Even before this, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had declared in a belligerent speech that no one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anyone else. We are continuing the war until the end, until total victory. When Myanmar received a similar order in 2020 to take emergency measures to prevent the continuing genocide of the Rohingya in Rakhine State, it was similarly defiant. Aung San Suu Kyi's government responded to the unenforceable ruling by declaring that there had been no genocide. Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, condemned the distorted picture that had been presented in the court by Gambia's legal team. Despite the ruling, genocidal persecution, targeted violence, apartheid segregation, and mass detention in Rohingya concentration camps and prison villages has continued. The outcomes from the ICJ hearings will be many years from now, and if and when they do come, they will be without force. Regardless of the time lag between accusations, orders, and determinations from the court, civil society organisations, journalists, and academic research teams have gathered an enormous amount of credible and validated evidence. There is more than enough in both cases to declare Myanmar guilty of genocide now. Indeed, the Gaza Tribunal operates precisely on the premise that genocide has taken place. We don't need a ruling from the ICJ to know that what we are witnessing in Gaza is genocide, or what we have witnessed in Myanmar is genocide. Myanmar learnt much from Israel's 75-year practice of cultural erasure in an effort to remove the physical traces of Palestinian history from what is now Israel. The state planted forests and built new Jewish settlements over the remains of destroyed Palestinian villages. It removed Arabic village names, Judaized the culture and history of historic Palestine, illegally created vast Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and repopulated Palestinian homes and towns with Israeli Jews. And not only Israeli Jews, of course. At the same time, it embarked on a Zionist archaeology, and later, in 2018, removed Arabic as an official language. Palestinians who remained in Israel lived under a military government which restricted their movement and prevented them from enjoying the full rights of citizenship. Research that Tom McManus in the audience and I were involved in October and November 2017 provided similar evidence of Rohingya cultural erasure in northern Rakhine State. The Myanmar government, the regime, had destroyed Rohingya cultural sites, including mosques, madrasas and markets, with the effect that virtually all memorable landmarks of the Rohingya landscape are now gone. You know, a Rohingya returning to northern Rakhine State would not be able to find their home effectively because everything has been destroyed. Moreover, our findings indicate that the Myanmar military had deliberately targeted Rohingya teachers, mullahs and imams, traditionally those community leaders who hold and pass on cultural, social and religious history. And that's what we've seen in Gaza, the attack on hospitals, on universities, on schools. Indeed, targeting those with a formal education in Myanmar has been particularly devastating in terms of cultural destruction, given that the Rohingya are, in effect, without a written language, and that almost 3/4 of the refugee camp population are illiterate and consequently dependent on an oral tradition. So it becomes an ever more urgent task, as Palestinian writer Raja Shehadeh observed, to record how the land felt and looked before this calamity, to preserve, at least in words, what has been lost forever. Understanding genocide as a process, that is, a series of interrelated state crimes, presents the possibility of intervening at the earlier stages of that crime, in the earlier stages of that process, in order to prevent genocide's ultimate goal of erasure. The acknowledgement that what we are witnessing is the annihilatory phase of genocide comes very, very late, too late for the people of Gaza, but perhaps less so for the Palestinians in the occupied territories of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Palestinian citizens of Israel. But only by understanding genocide as a process and recognising civil society as the force best placed to identify, name and resist it, can we even begin to think about ever stopping this crime of erasure? Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Next, we will be joined by Ayhan Çetil, who is currently a member of the philosophy department of Istanbul 29 Mayıs University. His academic studies focus on the fields of logic, philosophy of mathematics, and ontology on the one hand, as well as moral philosophy on the other hand. Ayhan Çetil will be speaking to us about the ethical implications and consequences of the ongoing genocide. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good morning. I am the most unfortunate panelist in this panel. I am talking after Penny and before Ilan, but I am going to do my best if I can. The title of my presentation is actually not the one written on the pamphlet. What comes to an end with Gaza and what should begin instead? Okay. This is better.
I was not informed.
Okay. I would like to thank all those who made this tribunal possible, and I want to say that I am honored to be together with you in this initiative, and it is a privilege for me to address such a distinguished audience. We are here expecting the Gaza Tribunal to name and judge those who started, maintained, and remained indifferent to the siege of Gaza, which spent many years and exhibited one of the most brutal and systematic forms of violence humanity has ever seen, and those who committed, supported, and remained indifferent to the massacres amounting to genocide. However, this scope, despite its importance, may be considered as limited from a certain viewpoint. What has happened since the beginning of the Gaza event has shown that humanity as a whole has failed to prevent such a shameful genocide and, to put it bluntly, to display effective moral agency. It seems that we, as humanity, have come to an undesirable point as a result of a long historical walk. With Gaza, the illusion that we are effective moral agents is over. With Gaza, the illusion that we are free is over, I believe. It has become clear that the people of Gaza, who have been living under siege for a long time, by taking the initiative to break this siege, has proven themselves to be free. And we, those living outside of that siege, have come to realize that we are the real prisoners. In my opinion, the events in Gaza constitute a turning point in the efforts of all humanity to be the agents for the actualization of what is good, and I sincerely hope that Gazans will not free themselves eventually, but they will bestow on us our own freedom. I believe that all intellectuals with humanitarian sensitivities, especially those who contribute to the Gaza Tribunal here, have an obligation to analyze the reasons for such impotence and paralysis. In other words, humanity must question everything that has brought us up to this undesirable point. The Al-Aqsa flood operation can be considered as an attempt to break through a cruel siege that has been going on for a long time and to put Gazans their own situation on the global agenda. But why was there such a siege? I think multiple and mutually non-exclusive answers can be given to this question. Actually, I believe there is more than one more going on in Gaza. I will name those as the following. First, a settler colonial power is trying to complete the settlement. Second, a nation-building government is trying to homogenize the population in its country. Third, an occupying force taking advantage of the vacuum created by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War is trying to complete its occupation. Fourth, a certain power whose mind is captured by some distant myths is trying to fulfill the promise that finds its meaning in the expression of Arz-ı Mevud. Fifth, and maybe some circles are trying to lay the groundwork for an Armageddon in their heads. Each of these wars, which are fought one after and the other, and in an intertwined manner, is the outcome of some historical processes and transformations, but humanity hoped to reach a good place as a consequence of these transformations. It seems that this hope is neither justified nor achievable. We need to sit down and question the background of all these war scenarios. First, why is there such a process as colonization or colonialism? Is it because capitalism as a mode of production cannot be overcome? Is it because it is always and without questioning, power is always and without questioning handed over to the owners of the capital? Second, why are there nation-building governments? Is it because it is believed that people's rights and futures are guaranteed only by their belonging to a homogeneous national whole? Third, why is there an occupation? Who prepared such an invasion and within which power vacuums? Fourth, why is the promise that finds its meaning in the expression Arz-ı Mevud brought to the fore? Why do people still feel the need for a mythical, religious positioning to legitimize their political actions? And the fifth group of questions, why are there those who want to stage some kind of an Armageddon? Do they want to use their military superiority to maintain their power while they lose the moral high ground they once had? We need to seek answers to all these questions and be able to properly criticize the historical processes that have brought us up to this point. These historical processes, I think, end up with the assumptions like the following. The ones who hold the capital at hand say the last word. They say so. Assimilating and even exterminating those who are not elite and privileged members of the nation is legitimate. This usurpation of someone's right on the basis of some kind of sanctity is acceptable. We can add some other assumptions of these ones, but I will not spend time on that. We hope that the Gaza Tribunal will declare that it is unacceptable in the eyes of humanity for these historical assumptions to constitute a justification for any such genocide in this case and ever in future. There is a book written by an American philosopher. The title of the book goes like this: Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Very nice title. The author of the book defends the thesis that although many people tend to think that the current scientific perspective of nature is quite fruitful, it fails to answer the most important philosophical questions like how organisms exist in a mechanical universe or how there can be conscious beings in a physical world. He might be right or wrong in his claims, but this book involves a call to rethink everything. Analogically, I believe that Gaza event has shown us that almost everything pertaining to the contemporary world order is certainly wrong, and we need to rethink everything. There is another academician I would like to name here, Johan Galtung, who introduced, or rather named, a very important concept. Galtung introduced the concept of structural violence. That concept is used to analyze how social structures and institutions can cause harm to individuals and groups. He argued that these structures, often embedded in inequality and injustice, can prevent people from meeting their basic needs and accessing opportunities, leading to suffering or harm, even without direct acts of violence. Hitting someone or bombing a territory is a direct form of violence. Galtung thinks that violence cannot be confined to this form only. There is another form of violence, which is, as he calls it, structural. What he means by that term roughly amounts to that. Since you live your life the way you live, and the order is established the way it is, some people fail to enjoy self-actualization. They cannot actualize their potential. The paradigmatic example he gives of this form of violence is poverty. Since capitalistic economic system is formed the way it is now, some people need to be unemployed and jobless to provide a pool of labor such that wages are kept below a certain effective level. I think Gaza event is an example of structural violence as well. Yes, Gazan people are subject to various forms of direct violence, including bombardments, starvation, various forms of torture, etc. But this form of violence is made possible by the way we, the peoples of Earth, continue to live our lives in the current world order as we do today. Most of us are so much afraid to lose the pleasures and privileges in our lives that we happen to turn a blind eye to many horrible things happening in Gaza or in various parts of the world. How did we come to this point in history? I believe that humanity experiences a loss of reality, or rather a historical process of a shrinking of our conception of reality. This process started with what is in itself being at the center of reality. Then that center moved to what is mental, and then to what is linguistic, and finally what can possibly be conveyed by signs themselves. The details of this process beyond the scope of this talk. What is important here for us is that this process of shrinking results in a loss of any meaningful moral limits to human action. If we can do something, we tend to do it. What is important is not doing what is right, but staying in the game at any cost. Recently, a new term has been coined to talk about this fact of a loss of reality, which is, as you all know, post-truth. Post-truth does not imply that people do not mention terms like truth or values, it implies that neither those who speak out those terms nor the listeners seriously mean them. The political leaders of the world are talking about right and wrong and truth. They do not mean what they are saying. They don't believe in them. This is the real quagmire we stuck in. This mindset provides the ground for various instances of evil actions to be committed by those who happen to capture power. Gaza is the latest and most devastating example of such deeds. So I believe that there is another war that is already going on and should go on. I believe that we are already at war, here and everywhere. This war has started with Gaza, and it will not end until we change the world order for a better one. The aim of this war is to develop a new intellectual and moral framework to work out a new and better world order where no such genocides ever happen again, and if anyone dares commit such crimes, moral and political actors like us take the initiative to stop them as soon as possible. This is not a war involving bombardments, not yet anyway. It may involve it in future, but a war against the mindset enabling such bombardments. This war needs to be fought in seminar or conference rooms like this one, if not everywhere in time. The state of humanity looks like a wreck, as if Rome is collapsing, but an initiative to defend and fulfill the principles of a just order for humanity is not yet on the horizon. What does the removal of this debris entail? Only an initiative which is able to make a radical critique of capitalism and transform our relationship with time, able to strengthen and protect individuals against formal institutions and structures, resisting the invasion of lands and minds, able to comprehend the stage we are in its broadest form, and able to offer a new position to humanity, can put away this wreckage. I hope that initiatives such as the Gaza Tribunal and others like it will be starting point for such an initiative. I hope that the Gaza Tribunal expresses with a strong voice that it is possible not to turn a blind eye to the miserable states of the oppressed in all its nakedness by bracketing out all possible interests and political biases, and that human beings are valuable in themselves, not because they belong to a nation or an ummah or a privileged group, and that humanity can come together against oppression. And finally, I will repeat what Raji Surani said yesterday. It is my firmest conviction that the Gaza Tribunal is the meeting point for those who are on the right side of history. Thank you very much.
So next, we're going to turn to Zoom, where you already see Professor Ilan Pape waiting to present. And of course, he needs no introduction, although he hasn't been with us for the past few days. But I'll just say a few lines about him. You all, of course, know that Professor Ilan Pape is an Israeli historian, political scientist, and professor at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, director of the university's European Center of Palestine Studies, as well as co-director of the Center for Ethno-Political Studies. I could list all the books that he's written, but we'd be here for a very long time. So I'd rather hear from him his intervention today, which will focus on the history of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Professor Ilan, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me well. I thought I would change a little bit my original idea of the intervention, partly because of the experience I had last 3 days. I'm in the midst of a lecture tour in Germany, and it seemed to me that especially this distinguished tribunal doesn't really need 10 to 15 minutes lecture on the history of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine. What it probably needs is to think together of how to make this history known and be digested and accepted on such a level that it would affect eventually both political decisions and legal decisions that would first and foremost bring an end to the current genocide in the Gaza Strip, but will also prevent the next chapters of both ethnic cleansing and possibly actions of genocidal nature in the West Bank and towards the 48 Arabs, the Palestinian minority in Israel. I would rather talk about the difficulties and challenges of conveying this history and ask myself and hope that we can engage in a discussion on it. Why is that history denied, ignored, and why is it continued to be ignored and denied even after 16 or 17 months of a televised genocide that has occurred in the Gaza Strip since October 2023. And I would like to offer two explanations, which I hope will be valuable and contribute to the discussion of the Gaza Tribunal that, as already was mentioned by Penny, are not coming from a legal perspective, but come from an historical perspective in challenging the clear silence, indifference, and lack of willingness to engage with Israeli genocidal policies in the past and in the present, with a great apprehension that that kind of indifference and that kind of inaction would also continue in the future. And I would prefer here two historical explanations. One is more historical, the one is more contemporary, for probably the most bewildering aspect of what happened since the 7th of October for many of us. I think that we were less, and unfortunately, surprised by the nature of the Hamas attack on the 7th of October. And most of us, I think, were not that surprised by the level of brutality shown by Israel in reaction to the 7th of October, or rather, how Israel exploited the 7th of October in order to implement its elementary policies of elimination, and in many ways trying to complete, or that particular Israeli political elite that is now in power, trying to complete what the old elite of 1948 was unable to do when it expelled half of Palestine's population within 9 months in 1948, destroyed half of Palestine's villages and most of its towns. It is not only the Palestinians that are calling the period between 1948 until today the ongoing Nakba or Nakba Mustamirra. It's also the Israelis who are talking very openly that the last operations in Gaza since the 7th of October are an attempt to complete what was incomplete in 1948. So I think these two elements of the situation, or these two aspects of the situation, namely the nature of the Palestinian resistance and the way it unfolded on the 7th of October in particular, and the nature of the Israeli retaliation and overall strategy since the 7th of October are not a topic that I think the Gaza Tribunal in particular needs to engage too deeply with, because I think there is already great literature and analysis of all of that. I do think we are lacking very much an analysis why the West and in particularly Europe, and particularly Western Europe, has shown that kind of indifference, even when the reality on the ground unfolded in such a way that you would have thought that any person with a modicum of decency in them would not remain indifferent, or any politicians looking at it would not remain passive in reaction to these actions, or the journalists and academics would be much more vociferous in their moral condemnation and political condemnation of what goes on. And this is not the reality. It is true that in the last 3 weeks, finally, we are hearing some different voices from European politicians, including in Germany, but this is not yet translated to any effective action of sanctions. It may unfold in such a manner later on, and definitely it shows that the pressure from below of the civil society and the solidarity movement eventually pays off and should continue. But we're still left with the question of the level of indifference. And I would preface, before I go to mainly my historical answer and less the less historical answer to that question, I want to preface and say that contrary to a common kind of assumption is that the key for a change in Israeli policy lies in Washington. I think that's a very limited analysis of what keeps Israel together, what provides Israel immunity, both political immunity, diplomatic immunity, economic immunity, and military immunity. I think Europe is as important as the United States. To my mind, is even more important than the United States in sustaining the Israeli policy. The flip side of this is that even if American policy doesn't change tomorrow, a dramatic change in the position of the EU and of Britain can bring an immediate stop to the genocide in Gaza. It's not going to bring the liberation of Palestine. It is not going to change the overall picture. But if we are looking for an urgent measure to stop the killing, the massive killing, the destruction, Europe can play a far more active and decisive role. And I'm talking mainly about the EU and Britain, a much more decisive role that would bring at least a temporary end to the current Israeli destructive policies on the ground. But the same reason that it's not happening, the same analysis that would apply to as an explanation why Europe is not doing what it could do, it also applies to the question, why is Europe indifferent? When I say Europe, of course, I'm talking about the political elites, media elite, academia elite in general, are indifferent or inactive towards the genocide in Gaza. So let me go to history and provide, to my mind, an historical context that I think is overlooked in most of the historical analysis of the immunity that the Zionist project enjoyed from the very beginning of its inception, and Israel as a state enjoyed since 1948, and surprisingly, and that is definitely still bewildering, is still enjoying at this period in time. And one of the major contexts to deal with it is to remind ourselves that Zionism is a European project. Israel, in fact, is a European project. Too many people fall into the Israeli framing of itself as a Jewish state, which obfuscates the fact that Israel is an organic part of Western Europe. And this kind of connection, a very bizarre and very complex relationship between Western Europe and the state that Europe helped to build in Palestine, this very complex and bizarre relationship of hate and love, if you want, of racism and admiration, totally contradictory emotions and positions and attitudes, explains why any dramatic shift in Western European position on Israel would unpack that kind of relationship and impose not only a very simplistic analysis of European complicity, namely how much trade is provided to Israel, how much arms is being provided by the European military industry to Israel, and so on, but far more important of how organic actually Israel is part of Western Europe, and therefore any action by the international justice systems, any action by the political elite, any action by the media elite, any action by the political elite would mean a European self-search and inflicting sanctions or harsh policies or tough challenges, not towards a country outside of West Europe, but towards a country which is part of West Europe. And this is something I don't think we appreciate enough to understand how difficult it would be for that elite to address Israel according to international law, according to universal codes of behavior, according to the various United Nations definitions of genocide or ethnic cleansing, because it would be almost as if you would direct that kind of accusation today, not towards an historical period, towards Germany, Britain, Ireland, or Norway. The reason that this organic connection exists goes back to the very origin of Zionism. After all, Zionism was a European solution for a European problem. The problem was European racism towards its European Jewish citizens. The inability of most West European countries and Central European countries to accept the Jews as citizens, that eventually led, through the rise of fascism and romantic nationalism, to the genocide of the Jews in the Second World War. The conclusion of most of the members of the European elite, both intellectual elite, political elite, and academic elite, in 1945, in fact, in the period between 1945 and 1948, was that instead of what some of them were suggested, instead of trying to plead with the Jews of Europe, even those Jews of Europe who already went to Palestine, to plead with them to come back to Europe and build together a Europe which would ensure that another Holocaust would not happen, a Europe that would ensure that it will deal fundamentally and properly with the racism towards Jews, so that it could deal in general with the problem of racism. Instead of doing that, what was preferred as an idea was something that was developed before the Second World War as a very minority idea, both among Jews and among Christians, that both for theological reasons and romantic reasons and colonialist reason and capitalist reason, the best thing is to say to the Jews of Europe, you're right, we cannot integrate you, so instead we will build for you a Western European country at the heart of the Arab world, at the expense of the Palestinians. That seems to be a win-win situation for all of us. We don't need you in Europe, and you will have a European state as you want to have, but you won't have it in Europe itself. This is something that explains the very close and organic connection between European thinkers, diplomats, imperialists, and their counterparts in the Zionist movement. The big question, of course, that all the time unfolded was, how does Europe react to the manifestation of the state, to what the state brought with it towards as a result of its inception, vis-a-vis the people, the native and indigenous people of Palestine. And what is incredible to look at as an historian is to see how elastic and flexible are the supposedly critical voices in Europe, whether these are politicians, intellectuals, academics, or journalists, whenever there is a sense that maybe the actual Israeli actions against the Palestinians, whether it is the ethnic cleansing of 1948, whether it is the Kafar Qasim massacre in 1956, whether it is the expulsion of 300,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, whether it's the Sabra or Shatila massacre, whether it is the daily abuse of civil and human rights in the West Bank, it is quite incredible to see how diplomats, academics, and politicians all the time develop the narrative which explains why actually the Israeli actions on the ground do not justify any deviation from the fact that Israel is part of us, that Israel is part of the Western world, that Israel is part of the West European world. And even if there is a misbehavior, even if there is a violation of international law or universal values, it is something that has to do with that or other government. And this is temporary, and it doesn't challenge the very ideological and moral fundamentals of the project that Europe helped to not only help to establish, but helped to sustain with material help, moral help, and diplomatic help. And that kind of connection or nexus was definitely dramatically tested in the last 2 years, but it withstood the test, unfortunately. It withstood the test because in the only way of pushing Europe, and I insist that Europe is even more important than the United States in changing the reality in Palestine, that it shows that even the events on the ground have not created the kind of shift in the basic political, intellectuals, cultural perceptions of Western European elites about Israel and its role in the world, its role in Europe, and so on. That's why the Palestinians became invisible for Europeans. That's why the Palestinians suffering and all the Israeli actions against them were recorded, are very well known, are not ignored as such, but are not leading to any serious contemplation of a different attitude, not towards one Israeli government or the other, but rethinking and reasserting about the project as a whole. And without reasserting and rethinking about the Zionist project as a whole, Europe will not take a tough action against Israel, although I do hope that we don't have to test this with even worse to come, because I can't imagine what could be worse than we've already witnessed on the ground. Let me finish by saying something else, which I think we should consider. And of course, I don't have time to develop the whole notion of the European moral guilt and moral panic and moral cowardness that stems, from my mind, from the fact that Israel is organically part of Western Europe. The second, and very shortly, because I'm running out of time, is to say that the challenge that European, especially politicians, but it is true also about academics and journalists, because as we know, the society at large has already, in many ways, internalized the need for a change in Europe. Although some of the society is now moving towards populist right-wing politics that delays the change in the civil society. But I'm talking about the elites or those who with the power to change realities on the ground in Palestine. I think it's worth paying attention, and I will do it in a soundbite, I don't have time to develop it, to think about the current caliber of Western European politicians, which probably is not exceptional for Western Europe. I don't remember a period in history when politicians were of such a low caliber. Politicians who are totally self-centered, are totally committed to one mission in life, which is to be re-elected. And we have a problem that this superficial, and I blame a lot the United States for exporting that kind of politics to Europe, this essence of politics means that as long as even the younger generation of politicians in Western Europe would believe that for electoral reasons, it is good to continue to provide that kind of fundamental support for Israel and remain and retain the position of the Palestinians as invisible, as people who have to pay the price for Europe's earlier historical problems, as long as they would believe that from an electoral perspective, this is the right position to have, it would be very difficult to expect from that kind of political elite to change dramatically the European position, either on the genocide in Gaza right now, or the more fundamental issues that are stopping us from pushing forward the liberation of Palestine altogether. And I will end on a more optimistic note. I think the fact that there is a general issue here of the essence of politics in Europe, of the level of politicians and so on, you can build, and we should build, a very wide alliance that suffer from that kind of politics, from that kind of immorality in politics, which is not only about Gaza and Palestine, but about a lot of many issues that concern the society in general, and which will never bother the politicians unless they are an assured formula for being re-elected. And that means that probably there is some strategic thinking here to be done about what could be a global Palestine alliance that does not only attend to the problem of Israel and Palestine, but also to the overall issues of what is universal justice, international justice, and the essence of politics in the so-called democratic world that can produce such an inhuman and unacceptable policy toward the genocide of Gaza, as we are still witnessing today on the 28th of May, 2025. Thank you.